Good afternoon, everyone. Very glad to be here with you today. I'm Kim Smith, the Executive Director of the League of Innovative Schools, and just excited to share with you another opportunity to hear from uh, leaders of color and leaders across the education sector addressing some really important issues to support students of color. I am representing the Rise Up Coalition, Digital Promise, along with Camelback Ventures, Education Leaders of Color, the Pahara Institute, Surge Institute, and Unidos US have come together as convening organizations and with our networks, respectively, to bring together a set of school district charter networks and organizations led by people of color with the sole purpose of developing an action agenda. Our why is really focused on the fact that we're dealing with these ripple effects across the education system of historically inequitable institutions, and these ripple effects continue to inflict these long-lasting impacts on our students and our families of color. So our concern is that the system is going to traditionally default to traditional approaches to addressing the needs of students of color. And so we've come together as a coalition to put together and publish a national action agenda, which will be released in June. That is going to reflect the priorities and the policy perspectives on what is needed to ensure that students of color are effectively supported and are able to thrive and lead productive lives. So we're going to rise up, if you will, programs and tools and models and frameworks that will help showcase the work that our leaders are doing across the country. Today, for our fifth webinar, the topic is a really important one, has always been an important one, but in the climate that we're living in today, it couldn't be more important. History matters, right? Honoring Indigenous teaching and learning models. And I'm so glad to have with me today Duda Flying Earth, who's the Executive Director of the NACA Inspired Schools Network, Zane Rosette, who's the Executive Director of the Native American Community Academy, and Casey Wise, who's Head of Education for the National Indian Education Association. Unfortunately, Sage couldn't be with us today due to an emergency in his family, but I'd like to welcome our three speakers here to turn on their cameras and join me as we start a conversation and learn more about your work and the importance of supporting Indigenous students. So welcome all of you, good to see you. Loving those backgrounds and just so glad to be with you here today. This is a topic that doesn't get enough visibility, enough respect, enough airtime. And so we are so excited to have you as members of the Rise Up Coalition and to be able to really hear your voices today and center in your voices and the work that you're doing. I am going to start by asking you to share a little bit about the work that you do, your organizations, and then we'll go ahead and dive into some more specific questions. For those of you in the audience, we invite you to submit questions in the QA. We'll take about 20-25 minutes to hear from our speakers and then open up the floor for questions. So I'm going to ask each of you to, briefly describe your organization. What do you do? What is your work focused on? And let's start with Duda to kick it off.
Yeah, greetings everybody. Dawa Chiankapi, Apoduta Makokia Macha, Lila Yushkiawa Chiankapi, Yamosla Mataha. Good to see everyone. Good to see familiar faces. Want to greet every one of you. Thanks, Kim, for hosting. Been fortunate to be a part of the Rise Up Coalition and part of some really important conversations. Coming to you from Albuquerque, New Mexico, homelands of the Tiwa, Caris, and lots of folks who would pass through these lands. I grew up on the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota. On my mom's side, I'm Lakota, Dakota, and Ojibwe, and on my dad's side, I'm Akimel Atum from Gila River Indian Community. And I'm serving as the Executive Director of the NACA Inspired Schools Network. A little bit about our network is that we're a network of Indigenous education schools that have from New Mexico, Colorado, and South Dakota, with a few more in the works in Minnesota, California, and as well as another more in the works in South Dakota and Colorado. So really good to be here, eager to dive into the conversation.
Great, thanks, Judah. Good to have you. Casey, welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. I'm Casey Wise, the Education Specialist for the National Indian Education Association. I'm coming to you from Memphis, Tennessee, the traditional homelands of the Chickasaw people, who many now reside in Oklahoma due to federal policy and forced removal. It is just an honor to be a part of this conversation, especially to be in the room with our NACA folks. That is a system and schools that we support. Our work is actually twofold. We were founded in 1969 by a group of Native educators out of the American Indian movement, meeting in Minneapolis, and knew that things had to change for our Native students. And so since then, we have worked, one branch of our work is in legislative advocacy, state and national level, our headquarters in DC. And so we do a lot of advocating on the Hill and really paying attention to what goes on at the state and national level. And the other part, which I'm directly a part of, is our educational programming. Again, always symbiotic to legislation, and our work just drives each other. But we do a lot of work around professional development, educator recruitment, supporting schools, really that networking partnership development piece, so that our schools, our students have access to services, culturally responsive materials, instructional resources, anything that schools need in order to support our students, whether it is tribally controlled schools all the way to our urban public schools that serve Native students. And so it is an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Great, thank you, Casey. And Zane, welcome.
Yeah, greetings, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to share. My name is Zane Rosette. I'm the Executive Director of the Native American Community Academy here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I am Anishinaabe, Nehio, which is Chippewa and Cree from Rocky Boy, Montana. I've been living down here for about 10 years. NACA is a district charter school in the urban area here that serves students in K through 12. And it grew out of the need and wants of our community of the larger school district, not meeting the needs of our students. So out of that blossom NACA, right now we serve about 500 students with 600 plus tribal affiliations. And what we try to do is really make our educational experience here at NACA relevant to our students, so that they're seeing and experiencing themselves, their communities, their tribes on an everyday basis. And that conversational piece and that experience is almost every part of what we do at NACA. And we really want our students to feel that they're welcome, and who they are is always going to be welcome in the doors of the school that we have here in the city. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to hear about the expansion, Judah, that you've had with the growth of your schools. What feels like a short time to me, since I've known you over the past, I guess, 4 or 5 years. I'd love for you to maybe kick things off to talk about, help the audience understand the kind of the core tenets of the teaching and learning model that you all have built, literally, and are advocating for.
Yeah. Yeah, and thanks for the recognition of the evolution. I think it's something that I think about often in terms of even what somebody like my grandmother worked on. And I appreciated Casey acknowledging the inception of NIEA and how in many regards it grew out of the social justice movement of the 60s and 70s, and the ways in which education has ebbed and flowed for Indigenous communities is something to pay attention to. Even in areas that may not have a large population of Indigenous or Native American folks. I think, like, if you think about the evolution or the timeline of Indigenous education, we first and foremost acknowledge that Indigenous education predates schools. right? That the systems and structures of proliferating knowledge, understanding, skills, and genius has been present in our communities since time immemorial, and that it still is. I think when we talk about schools, inception of schooling has been boarding schools, and literally came with the mantra, kill the Indian, save the man. So there's some emotional and historical memory that's attached to education for Indigenous communities. And I think it's actually one of the links to many communities of color across the country. And I think that's something to take into consideration in terms of like where we are now, is articulating an education model by community. There are lots of things that led to it. Indian Self-Determination and Education Act was an important one, establishment of tribal colleges. And in 2021, like there's been a lot of different iterations of survival schools, freedom schools, tribally controlled schools that have given way to why NACA exists, and asking similar questions, right? Like, so I grew up on the Standing Rock Reservation, and my grandma was my other parent, and she would often ask questions of like, well, how do we articulate the tribal values and structures that center language, knowledge, culture, and understandings of the Indigenous education frame that I talked about earlier. And then what does it look like for our own people to be the teachers, to be the principals of the schools and the structures that we're talking about? And I think it's taken a lot of different forms over the course of the last few decades. And I think like we're in a time now where we have the people with the knowledge and expertise who are ready to do the work. And so part of the existence of the NACA Inspired Schools Network is it really forms out of NACA, and where Zane is leading, and folks come into the school and asking questions of how can we do what you guys did, and acknowledging that it's not an anomaly in terms of the story of NACA, and it should be more commonplace. And so how do we not be stingy with the knowledge that we have, and what we've learned, the mistakes we've made, the successes we've had. So that was the impetus for the network.
Thanks, Duda. You talk about language, knowledge, culture, understanding, tribal values. I'm curious, Casey, as you think about kind of the perspective of your organization, can you, elaborate on some of the core tenets of how you look at teaching and learning?
Sure. I think one of the kind of the beauty and the challenge to this work is that ideally NIA supports and promotes, education sovereignty. Duda talked about that since time immemorial, and those systems of Indigenous knowledge have always been around, and the reality is, I know we use that cliche of it takes a village to raise a child, but education was always a community aspect when you study those traditional systems. And, as a national nonprofit organization, NIA has that line of supporting tribal sovereignty, supporting educational sovereignty, promoting schools like NACA that are doing this in the community and taking back that community approach and sovereignty for their students. And at the same time, also knowing that we have to navigate these systems that have been put in place. I'm a non-native person, but I always wanted to be a teacher. And I studied teaching from, 5 years old, trying to be a teacher with my stuffed animals in the room and going through the traditional college program. And that was like embedded in me to just love this profession. And I wanted everyone to have a great education, but I was one of those that was raised with so many gaps in my historical understanding. And so then I began, about 10 years ago, I taught in alternative schools here in Memphis. And that put me front and center with a lot of the struggles that our students of color have. And then working with NIA over the past 6 years, it really, I don't know how to put it nicely, it broke me as far as that illusion of what education was. And as I really took a really deep understanding and look at the education system that has been put in place, predominantly public ed, when you go back and look at the roots of forced assimilation, these industrial pieces, of history of why public school took place, it took away that community base. And so here we are now, a century later, trying to reclaim communities and schools and reclaim sovereignty over education, and really look at how what our students need are those anchors of identity within their community, all of those different facets of identity. And so with our work at NIA, it's beautiful because it is diverse. There's no one size. We really support work at the regional level for schools to be able to discuss and determine what they need, and then figure out how to create those partnerships and networks for them to be able to actually really see themselves, like representation and everything that they do, from our educator initiative, where we are recruiting teachers, native teachers, and being able to give this open job board for schools to recruit, to the same piece of professional development for educators, and then also working with other educational organizations or schools to really teach that history of federal policy that has created that system of mistrust, and to talk through boarding school and what it means to be trauma informed, and then also to celebrate resiliency, that self-determination piece. And that looks different in many communities, and that's the beauty of it, as well as the complexity. And so we are I've followed NACA for a while now, so I'm really excited to just get to sit here and talk with y'all. But at the same time, like, that's the place where this is happening, and there are other communities that need that same framework, and that's really behind the work that we do.
Great, thank you. So Zane, you are, running a school, working day to day, and this notion of, kind of education was always community. Do you want to talk a little bit about, what's happening in your school in terms of the core tenets of teaching and learning?
Yeah, for sure. I think for the most part, and Duta kind of led this front also, is we practice a shared leadership model at NACA, where it's not just one person. I'm not solely responsible for pushing an agenda. We're trying to get that perspective from all stakeholders, teachers, students, community, families, on what is important for them to being able to see where they want their children moving forward. And out of that came, a lot of goals that we've established of we want our students to be able to be healthy, secure in their identity, and prepared academically for whatever may be in their future. And then leading a school, I think we're always trying to push the boundaries of how to do things better. Currently this summer, our elementary team, which is K through 5, is going to start looking at some curriculum for redeveloping our literacy program, because normally what schools in Indian country look at is your basic run-of-the-mill curriculum that's provided, that's research-based, which is fine. At the same time, we're trying to look at that as a framework to being able to develop our own, something that's a little more culturally relevant for our community here in Albuquerque, and hopefully being able to share that with some of our partner schools. And we're actually working with a couple of partner schools right now to basically cross-pollinate our ideas. Right now, we're working with people within the NISN network to work with first grade teachers from another community, working with our first grade teachers to be able to establish what it means to have a culturally relevant education in elementary school. And the hopes of that programming is being able to still push our students academically, and still being able to give them worldly options in terms of visiting places throughout the curriculum, understanding different communities other than our own, at the same time that we're still learning true facts and true representations of ourselves, which I don't think we've been able to experience. If I could think back on my elementary school, which was in North Central Montana, basically a reservation school with 99% Native students, I rarely saw my community reflected in the curriculum. And so we're definitely trying to change that at NACA and other schools in the Southwest that we're kind of working with. And at the same time, today, right outside our doors, we have a vaccine drive going on. We're responding to community need, what our community wants and needs in terms of us being able to prepare our students for a safe reentry in the fall, because right now we are still virtual learning because our community was polled back in early spring of whether or not they felt safe sending their kids back to school. And the vast majority of our community members did not feel safe. And how can we pivot as a school to be able to meet the need of our community? And so we felt the need to stay virtual, and we feel like our virtual program is going well and we're meeting needs, but at the same time, we wish we could be face-to-face, right? But we are not there yet in terms of safely being able to do that. And this vaccine drive today is just one of those steps of being able to get our parents and students prepared safely for the fall and reentry back into the school campus. And that culturally relevant curriculum that I mentioned earlier for elementary, our middle school teams have already gone down that path of developing their own curriculum at the literacy level for 6 through 8. And we have a model in-house to be able to look at of how they built, how they planned, and how they implemented that. Obviously, we're going to be changing that a little bit to fit elementary needs. And then at the high school, that's one of the future goals of being able to do that more strategically with our high school teachers. And then working with the network, we'll be able to provide teachers with stipends to be able to work on this in the summer, to be able to be compensated for their time and efforts and expertise, because a lot of genius is coming out of our staff here in our community. And it's just our opportunity to shine that light on them and let them show what they truly want to be able to share in terms of curriculum, culturally relevant curriculum to our students.
Thanks, Zane. You know, Zane is talking about the creation of curriculum and other kind of components, professional development. Dude, I remember maybe a couple of years ago when I was in a meeting with you and a bunch of other folks, you were talking about this idea of understanding identity, right? And really kind of honoring identity, and that you all were developing kind of resources around that piece. Do you want to talk a little bit about, you know, what your network has done to really center on identity?
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind, Kim, is the update on that conversation is probably a connection to land. And all of us, whether we identify as Indigenous or not, derive a connection to the place where we are, whether that's where our ancestors lived or not. And I think there's something special about a connection to the land and the place, in terms of your own articulation of identity, and even the story that's told in your family, right? Like, the story that's told in my family is in the here and now is one where my mom is rooted in Standing Rock in South Dakota, and my sister and I are rooted here in Albuquerque. You go a couple generations back, there's a whole story about displacement, in terms of my great grandparents, my grandma's parents, went to Carlisle Indian School and were taken from my great grandma's home in Standing Rock, and then my great grandpa's home in Red Lake, Minnesota. And before that is the story about the uprising in Minnesota that happened with the Dakota resistance to the resistance to the United States government for not providing basic necessities in the time where the access to it was being restricted. So, you know, it's an interesting kind of like story of connection as I think about Minnesota, South Dakota, Standing Rock Reservation, my dad's side in Arizona, where my mom grew up in Los Angeles. And what does that mean for me in terms of where I derive my identity, right? Like, there's you know, like the contextual piece is that there's a story of colonization, there's a story of resilience, there's a story of perseverance, there's a story of joy and genius, and there's a story of sadness. And so I think we try to lift up those experiences for our families and our students, and recognizing that every single one of our students and families has one of those stories. And I think if we think a couple layers into the story of identity, is then like as a 5-year-old, as an 11-year-old, as an 18-year-old, what does school mean in the development of who you are? Connection to friends, a place where you are for 8 hours out of your day, for 9 months out of the year, a place where you learn socialization. So I think there's something to be said in terms of like how you see yourself, like Zane was talking about, in the experience that you have in the content and curriculum, and then how you experience the story of place and space and land of where you are, and what that means, and even the extension to the place where your ancestors are from, and the story of movement or migration, and is that one of trauma or one of joy or both? So I think there's something to be said about that. We think even another layer in, during the pandemic, the land became a source of healing for a lot of our families. Our team led a initiative to do land-based learning boxes, native literature boxes, that at its core was the charge of like, how does the land and the medicines and the plants and the foods that come from it in this moment serve as a place of healing? And so there's even a metaphysical or an emotional or a spiritual type of connection you have to land. And probably one of the reasons that, like hiking and rock climbing and skiing and snowboarding are so popular in places like Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona, because there's something special about that land and about the places that we go to. And so how do we bring those experiences not as a one-off type of experience for students, but one that is all encompassing of content and curriculum?
I love what you share, because it's, land is not just the place where we live, like where we exist, right? There's so much history and meaning and layers, and you've named all the layers, which I really appreciate. Thank you for doing that. Zane, I want to hear about students who come through the NACA experience, right? What is your hope for how they emerge from this, right? This identity-centered experience, and then how they're able to step out into a world that, as we all know, is not the embracing space, right, for identity of folks of color.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of that was developed, like I said before, from our community. They had this vision and these goals set forth of how they wanted school to engage with them and their students. They wanted their students prepared for a future, whether that be higher education, job, military. They wanted their students not to have to leave who they are at the door in an effort to be able to adapt to a curriculum. And they wanted their students to be respected in terms of like relationships. Or am I going to be able to get genuine relationships with staff, other students at this school in this urban area? Because what we see on a daily basis is we are basically seeing a tribal community smack dab in the middle of this urban area. Our families always strive to participate and volunteer, and that's going to be our task for the next year, of seeing how that works in terms of like the pandemic. How can we still be attentive to those needs of our family to want to be involved? Because that's one of the number one driving goals of what we do, is how we connect with those families. And then at the same time, our students long to be here. They long to develop those relationships with the staff. And I think that's been the hardest part for us learning during distance learning, is that social emotional deficit that we're having right now and seeing amongst our students, is we long for those relationships. Yes, we can still have those genuine relationships virtually, but at the same time, it's not the same. And so we worked creatively to be able to establish that a little more. We have an out of school time program virtually that's run by one of our alumni students that actually came back to the school and is giving back because of the belief that they have in our community. We have a parent engagement director who is solely tasked with engaging our community of the needs. We've had families that have struggled during the pandemic, like any community. And this individual within our community has brought people together to ensure that no one's going hungry, that everyone has what they need in terms of school supplies. And then we've also worked with other networks. When Duta led the NACA school at the beginning of the year, we were able to utilize funds in a different way because some of our funders were definitely gracious. Our majority of our funders were gracious enough to be flexible with those funds to help us provide rent assistance to families that were struggling. So I think our number one job is respect and relationships. How are we being respectful to who we are working for? And how do we work intentionally to build those positive relationships with them? And from there, I think we could dream and come up with that dream that is a collaborative in nature, that we want our students prepared for the future. And what does that mean when we prepare for the future? Does that mean we have a culturally relevant curriculum that came out of this? Do we have clubs after school that meet the need of our community? So we're constantly evolving based on parent, student, staff need of what we feel is going to be more beneficial to our students moving forward. Obviously, we have some pillars that are always stuck in place at NACA, but for the most part, we have a flexibility within our institution to be able to be more responsive a little quicker than we would if we were outside of this network.
Great, thank you. I'm going to invite folks from the audience to share questions on the chat in about 5 or 10 minutes. We're going to open up the floor and see if there's any questions. I love that people are kind of posting from where they are in the chat box here. Casey, I'm going to kind of put you in the position of addressing one of the challenges that are that has kind of arisen over the past several weeks around critical race theory. And particularly as an organization that has a kind of a legislative and advocacy perspective. Clearly we are at a time in this world where there are so many kind of political, I don't even know what the word is, right? Just kind of, I would say just games being played and manipulations that are happening around, aspects of this work as it relates to supporting students of color most effectively. So can you share, I mean, as you're, kind of seeing these issues emerge and what action states are taking across the country, and where your organization is, what conversations are you having? What are you thinking about kind of the legislative and advocacy side? And I'm going to go to Duta, you and Zane after this. So just a heads up on that.
That is it's just a huge question to tackle. It is something that has weighed on us internally. Each one of my colleagues are in different states. I'm in Tennessee. We have some in Oklahoma, Arizona, DC, Massachusetts. Like, we're spread out as a national organization. And one of the things that we have in common is that we all have the same mission and vision, the same belief about what Zane and Duta have already spoken to, is students seeing themselves every day in school, not having to adapt to school, but that our programs adapt to them and their needs. And, when this critical race issue popped up over the last few weeks, it's been frustrating to me because, I'll be honest, through my doctoral program, studying critical race is what enlightened the work that I do. It has pushed me to think about systems, our legislative systems, our financial systems, the way schools are zoned. My body of work really lies heavily in curriculum, and not just overseeing like folks who are doing the amazing work of creating culturally responsive and culturally sustaining bodies of work and instructional materials, but also pushing back on big box publishers. Zane talked about a lot of schools just automatically purchase things that either they get good marks, or they're cost effective, or they look flashy. We love flashy in education, but the reality is there are just silences that history has silenced. It's always chosen, to match the majority and those Eurocentric ideas. And so we've began to, I think just in this last year, there's been so much upheaval, and things that we've known that have been here a long time. Critical race theory has been out for a while. It was intentionally started out of law, looking at legality of things. And now we're beginning to see how that also applies to society, and it's hard. It's hard for some groups who have lived through those oppressive restraints. And then those who, like some of the people that I meet in my day-to-day work, or some people that I have known in the past, people who are even close to me, who sit back and say that that's not the job of the school. We recently celebrated a win in I think it was North Dakota, in, K-12 curriculum, it was North Dakota, right? Yeah. Voted to bring in, native teaching in K-12, and it's mandated, and there's this big movement. And then you take all these steps back with these states that say, and they did it very quickly. And here in Tennessee, I saw a news report that just shocked me. It was like 15 seconds of, the House has decided to vote on this anti-critical race bill. And it was like a 15-second blurb. And I spent a day trying to get a group together to go advocate, and do this. And then they voted on it the next day, and that was it. We had no time to respond. And this is all coming out of a place of absolute fear of what's been taking place over the last year. And at NIA, in our legislative work, we are supporting states in advocating, writing against, gathering coalitions in order to speak out against this. But in that program, the program side, I'm going to tell you one of the wonderful things we're doing right now, but also that can just stir up just emotional frustrations even in our team, is that we have a lot of great projects that are developing resources and curriculum units and things like that. We have a veterans curriculum coming out, a Native veterans curriculum, but at the same time, we've also been approached by publishers who want to be more, you can fill in the blank, respectful, responsive, like that. But then when you really start pushing that envelope, is that really true? Because it takes a major upheaval. It takes an overhaul of policy. It takes an understanding of critical race theory, which many people just refuse to truly understand what that means. And it also takes like the growth of what NACA is doing, that type of framework, that type of passion, that acceptance of community, and really learning to adapt to the community. Like that's the only way that we're going to be able to really challenge what's going on right now, because it's that silence. It's that not knowing. K-12, so many students, even Zane said, hey, I didn't see myself in most of my early curriculum, my early education. And a lot of our students, Native and non-Native, are not seeing these truths represented in class. And that's really what critical race theory says, is happening. It's a lens that we have to look at, and it's painful sometimes. But we've got to face that in order to get better.
Thanks, Casey. And I appreciate Alcine summing up, institutionalized foolishness, which as someone of color, growing up, Zane, my experience was similar to yours, and to think about how it feels emotionally, mentally, psychologically to not be seen it's hard to put words to that. Due to, you're hearing the stories, kind of how are you thinking about this issue? And, is there an opportunity that NACA has in terms of the positions that you all take to address what's happening?
Yeah, I think the similar type of questions, wonderings, and ideas are happening across the country in different communities. And I wonder, the Rise Up Coalition stands to be one of the coalescers of the different initiatives, hence these panels, right? Hence the conversations that are gathering folks to intentionally talk about what is our responsibility in this time, and what is our responsibility to our communities and to our students to do better. And I think that, there was, Kim, you asked a question a while back in one of the Rise Up coalitions that was it made me think, to what extent are we lifting up our own community to articulate the things that we're looking for? And I think that has to continue, right? Like, how do we look introspectively at the ways in which we've replicated institutional racism, whiteness, and oppression. And how will we stand as organizations to address that in the ways that we're delivering programming or supporting schools, students, parents, and families? And what does that mean for a collective effort? I think is pretty exciting. I'll also say that, like, and shout out to Idrissa Simmons on here, because we read an article recently that really tried to lift up the groundwater metaphor, and I've been thinking about that ever since. And in some ways, as educators, we've been conditioned to think nonpartisan, non-political, and I think there's something to be said about that because of the dollars that flow into schools. But how do we think a little bit more widely, a little bit more divergent in terms of the ways in which we're affecting community transformation and change? And I think it's multifaceted, right? Like, there's at the network, there's a educator pipeline strategy. There's an advocacy and lobbying strategy. There's a teacher professional development strategy. There's an identification and capacity building of school leaders. And so I think, like, how do we build these different things and partner with each other to expand on what we're able to do from state to state? I think the last thing that I'll say is, if I think about Indigenous education, and thinking about your question too, Brian, I think we need to not think of it as an Indigenous issue, but as an everyone issue, as something that everyone should think about and actively engage, to think about how are our schools pro-Indigenous education. And I don't say that to say that it's, I want to disrupt the either or type of frame, because I don't think it comes at the expense of something else. And I think that's an ongoing conversation in a lot of different realms. But I think there's a piece about cross movement. There's a piece about, like, the hard work for us to be together and plan things together, and not just show up for each other's events, but to do things together and acknowledge the ways in which we have similarly been impacted by systems of oppression and colonialism, and are actively engaging the ways to lift up our emergent genius.
Thank you for that. Zane, if okay with you, I'm going to go to the question in the chat because it's focused on how, if at all, is NACA dealing with the pandemic teacher burnout shortages, and what promising teacher PD or teacher prep practices do you see in your work?
Yeah, good call. I was actually trying to type a response to that question. So we definitely felt it here and are still feeling it with our teachers. And I think we made a pivot around the end of first quarter of this past year of hearing from our teachers, our facilitators, which are basically our teacher leaders that run their department, their lead teams, just that teachers were having these feelings around that burnout, that fatigue, just that social emotional deficit that we all kind of felt through this pandemic time. But we were able to make a pivot during our PD session. So we at NACA, we have PD once a week. Every Wednesday we'll go through PD 1 to 4 o'clock with our staff, and we were able to carve out a half hour at minimum on a weekly basis to attend to relationships and teacher wellness. And sometimes it was stretches, it was yoga, sometimes it was sports trivia, sometimes it was teacher driven of the interest that they wanted to attend during this time and attend to their wellness. And we sought out community partners that would come in and basically run some of these PD sessions, or our own staff can volunteer and run some of these sessions. So I think the biggest thing is being responsive to your community, being responsive to your teachers, what's that feeling we all have moving forward? Is energy lacking? Are we not being more attentive to our students, to our parents? And at that same time, all of that has to come out of systems. I mentioned before, we have a shared leadership model. And within that shared leadership model, we have an instructional leadership team with teachers and admin, ancillary service, people that are all a part of this team. And on a weekly basis, we meet, we have some highs and some lows. What are we hearing? What are we seeing amongst our staff and our students? And so we have conversations around this so that things are heard and things are visible, and we're not pushing them to the side and hoping that they go away. These are real issues, because I guess our feeling is if our teachers are attended to, that they're going to give the maximum that they can to our kids and the community. And if admin is being attentive to that, we're going to be more responsive and flexible to those needs and opening up doors to being able to listen to some of the needs of our teachers or some of the ideas of our teachers. So sometimes it may look organic in a way, because sometimes these opportunities or these experiences don't fit into every single box you have. So you're constantly assessing yourself as an institution of where can flexibility lie and where can't it lie. And definitely within this professional development, teacher responsiveness, flexibility lied there. And we were able to pivot there to be more attentive to our teacher needs. And also with our community engagement director, with Mr. Flyinger's leadership, we were able to, at times during the year, celebrate our teachers, whether that was a drive-through ceremony. And we would be, I mean, it was pretty hilarious. At the same time, we would have a microphone out there. We're trying to hype up our teachers, present them with things, and just show appreciation for their effort and their time, and being vulnerable ourselves. And a lot of the time, it's hoping to get a smile out of your staff based on the fact that, I see you, I hear you, and I just want to let you know, like, we're thankful that you're here. And so some of those things definitely developed out of that need to just be responsive to them and acknowledge their efforts. And I think that goes a long way also. And along with, listening and hoping that you can pivot within your systems.
Thanks, Zane. As we come up to the last 5 or 6 minutes here, one question I would like to ask that builds on something that you said, Duda, is, you said Indigenous education is not just an Indigenous kind of opportunity. It's everyone. It's an opportunity for everyone, right? So if you think about teachers or schools or districts that want to collaborate and bring practices and models into their work to support their students, who do they talk to? Where do they go? What's a step or that they could take? Maybe each of you can tackle that, starting with Duda.
Yeah, there's probably a community close that has been asking that same question of how does the identity of the local people show up in the content and curriculum of education for all students. And as I think about like what exists, amongst the 560 plus tribes, and how they've articulated, the epistemology, the ontology of how they believe and what the particular tribe or community has done over the course of years. I think there's a pretty vast amount of information. Unfortunately enough, a lot of it exists in kind of antiquated perspectives of anthropology and ethnology. But I think there's a lot that's out there. I'm sure, NIEA brings folks together around these types of conversations in terms of like the convenings. Most states have Indian education departments, Native American education departments. Some states even have the ACT, Indian Education Act, or Education for All, like in Montana, or the Sovereignty Curriculum in Washington, Ocheti Shakui and Essential Understandings in South Dakota. And so those are resources. and I think there's, you know, there's a lot in terms of its translation to K-12 education. And you know, I think those us on the call, you know, have been building banks of knowledge in terms of, like I said earlier, that the network kind of like exists to share knowledge, and that's true, because we want to make sure that, like, you know, folks aren't having to recreate the wheel. So I think, you know, like those of us on the call are resources as well. And, you know, like we have an Indigenous knowledge resource hub at the network, that reaches across all 8 schools. So you can go and see a curriculum map for 3rd grade core values curriculum at NACA. You could see how deep a school in Navajo, New Mexico is thinking about science from an Indigenous perspective for the 10th graders. So it can get as large as like standards that exist from tribe to tribe, and as granular as like, well, what does that look like for a 9th grader in math for culturally relevant curriculum and content. I think those were the types of things that when we first started NACA in 2006 were hard to find. That is, you know, that bank has grown larger now.
That's great. Thank you for that. Casey, anything you want to mention as well?
Sure, I would love to. Duda brought up a really good point about that there is a range of Indigenous materials for teachers. There are Indian Ed departments, there are organizations like NIA that do this work, but the difficult part is that they tend to be very regional, or people just don't have that hub, or that, like you were talking about, that resource hub. And that was something 5 years ago, our executive director, Diana Canoyer, talked about, like this need for a repository or a centralization of people to share, not this one person trying to create things and disseminate them, but to create this massive database. You know, we have databases for everything else. Why don't we have one for these resources that are amazing? I mean, state departments, school systems like NACA, networks like that have created resources, but they always are seen as like this supplemental, I got to go find them and it takes more work. So NIA is excited. We're finally in the last 6 to 8 months of launching that resource repository and just inviting people to share those so that they'll be searchable, printable, searchable, viewable. Teachers will be able to go to this one place, not anything that NIA says we own, but to be able to offer that to groups like NACA, to be able to share those frameworks and anything that would benefit our students. So that teachers, leaders, I know someone had asked about policymakers, there will be something that anybody can search, researchers. And I mean, it's been a dream. It's exciting to see it finally coming about. Our goal is for it to grow. But you know, NIA we don't ever say, just reach out to us and we'll take care of everything, because there are so many wonderful groups like NACA that can do this and that can share experiences. But if you're not sure who to start with or where to start, reach out to us, nia@nia.org. And we are always happy to figure out who we can connect you with, schools that we know are doing the work. We have a great legislative team that we can connect you to as well. So stay with us, and Zane and Duda, I know we'll be reaching out to you as we get ready to launch this as well. So thank you.
All right. Well, we're coming down to the final stretch here, the last 2 minutes. You know, I just want to share that it's personally meaningful for you all to be part of the Rise Up Coalition work and collaboration, and just thank you for being here. And you know, this is what folks need to hear. We are recording this session, and it's going to be shared out to our lists and beyond. So thank you for your time and for being here today. And we're going to wrap up here, folks. This is the end of our webinar series from the Rise Up Coalition. We'll be back. We've got an action agenda launching in June. that's going to talk about, the perspectives that leaders of color across the country in education, in charters, in districts, in organizations have, and what's out there, what's working, like what's happening in the NACA network, the NACA schools, the National Association. So more to come from us. Take care. Have a good holiday weekend, and see you soon. Bye-bye.